Until the lions have their own historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. For centuries, there has been a concerted effort to diminish the role that Black people have played in shaping the world. This includes civilizations in Africa, Asia, Europe, and America, where the achievements of Black people have been either whitewashed or ignored. We aim to dismantle the mindset of white supremacy in the African consciousness, using peaceful and intellectually honest methods. We aspire to be the last generation of Black people who endure extreme humiliation and destruction due to the erasure of our history. Why does the West still misrepresent African history? There are several reasons. The original tendencies of violence and dominance from the West haven't entirely disappeared. While Western societies may have become more lenient towards their own citizens, there's still a subtler form of this violence directed at Africans. There's a desire to maintain the ideology of the Renaissance and white supremacy, which positioned the West as a global power. Admitting the truth is challenging because the lies about African history have been deeply ingrained and widespread. Acknowledging these falsehoods would mean the West accepting responsibility for a historical wrongdoing on a massive scale. Many Westerners find it hard to accept that modern Western civilization, despite its positive aspects, is built on significant falsehoods and has racist foundations. There's a fear among some groups that admitting the truth about the past mistreatment of Africans, including ongoing cultural erasure, might lead to retribution. For example, despite scientific evidence, the Black origins of the builders of civilizations in places like Morocco, Carthage, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley are often overlooked. In Europe, the contributions of the Minoan, Etruscan, and Moorish civilizations, and even Stonehenge, are not widely acknowledged as having Black roots. In the Americas, the Olmec civilization's Black origins are similarly disregarded. In Africa, the civilization of Zimbabwe was not attributed to Africans until after the end of apartheid in the 1980s. Even today, many still believe that the indigenous Swahili and Somali civilizations were the creations of Arabs, not Africans. The Egyptian civilization has been recognized as the greatest in history for its advanced knowledge and technical achievements. Despite a UNESCO conference in 1974 acknowledging its African roots, Egypt is still often portrayed as having a predominantly white heritage. This misrepresentation has led to a significant question. How did the people who were central to the development of these civilizations come to be seen as the very opposite of civilization? This video aims to trace the motivations behind this historical distortion and detail the process used in this misrepresentation. So when did the historical inaccuracies regarding the racial identity of the ancient Egyptians begin? Initially, the ancient Egyptians were commonly recognized as Black people. This perception was evident in Roman mosaics dating from the 1st to 6th centuries CE, and also in Byzantine art, such as the 11th century depiction of Sarah, Abraham, and the Pharaoh. Many European and Arab writers from these periods acknowledged the ancient Egyptians as Black. However, this accurate representation started to change during the High Middle Ages. This suggests that the shift in the portrayal of the ancient Egyptians' racial identity did not occur until many centuries later. Up until the Middle Ages, it was widely recognized that the ancient Egyptians were Black. This view was supported by numerous European and Arab writers of that era. However, the distortion of this historical truth began much later. To fully understand this change, it's important to first examine a specific aspect of Western perspective that emerged around this time. It is important to recognize the historically violent nature of European, Western culture, comparing it to other regions of the world. It's noted that Europe has been a particularly conflict-ridden area, starting from ancient times with the Roman Empire, through the Middle Ages with events like the Hundred Years' War and the Crusades, and into the modern era with the World Wars. This map, showing global conflicts over 4,500 years, places Europe at the forefront in terms of violence. It has been suggested that Europe's hostile climate and limited natural resources might have driven its people to conquer and destroy others' lands and resources for survival, fostering a culture focused on domination. In contrast, the civilizations in the southern regions, which, despite having their own conflicts, are said to have developed more humanist cultures. Indeed, the African ideal of Mahat, a concept of peace and humanism, is also credited with influencing peaceful ideologies in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. We have covered this in a recent video. Europe's violent past initially targeted Europeans themselves and was not initially driven by racial hatred. For example, Rome's destruction of Carthage and suppression of the African cult of Isis were seen as strategic, rather than racially motivated. Anti-black racism and historical falsification arose much later, particularly during the period of Western enslavement of Africans. As Europeans expanded their empires, they exerted extreme violence in the Americas and Africa. For example, over a period of 160 years, the Portuguese Empire used cannons to destroy around 15 African kingdoms and empires that resisted their slave trade. By the end of the 17th century, much of the resistance in Africa had been subdued. Several African states began to participate in the slave trade, selling their war captives in exchange for firearms. This led to a significant increase in the number of Africans being sent to America for enslavement, replacing the European workers who were also suffering under harsh conditions. This period marked a change in perception, where being black became synonymous with being a slave. To maintain and justify this lucrative trade, which had enriched Europe after the Middle Ages, Western societies began to dehumanize black people. This marked the solidification of the equation, black is equal to slave, in Western consciousness. Before we proceed, I would like to lay down a simple, unquestionable truth. In the words of Henrik Clark, there are no races. A people are identified by land, history, and culture. In what might appear to be contradictory, we subscribe to using racial designations on this channel for a reason. While you personally may not believe in the idea of race as a valid or scientific category, it's important to recognize that society often operates within this framework, and it has tangible effects on people's lives. As a black individual, you're positioned uniquely to confront and engage with the issue of race, even if you see it as a flawed construct. This means addressing racial topics through the same societal lens that originally established and perpetuated these concepts, albeit erroneously. It's about understanding how historical and social constructs of race have shaped experiences, perceptions, and opportunities for people, particularly those identified as black. Now, let's continue. The concept of white supremacy, as mentioned in Robert P. Baird's article, The Invention of Whiteness, The Long History of a Dangerous Idea, has deep historical roots. In the late 17th century, Europeans began to identify themselves as white to differentiate themselves from Africans, whom they intended to enslave. This marked the beginning of a harmful dichotomy, portraying whites as superior, intelligent, and civilized, in contrast to Africans, who were unfairly depicted as inferior and savage. This perspective led to the dehumanization of African people, justifying their enslavement, as they were seen as lesser beings. Key thinkers during the European Renaissance and scientists in the 19th and 20th centuries worked hard to reinforce this false narrative of black inferiority and establish a hierarchy with whites at the top. In the eras of slavery and colonization, there was a deliberate effort to erase any historical accounts that portrayed Africans as intelligent, powerful, or dominant. The idea of Africans having any advanced civilization was mocked, and the suggestion that they might have been more advanced than Europeans was considered outrageous. The claim that African civilization, particularly Egypt, played a foundational role in world history, including Europe's development, was seen as highly offensive. Martin Bernal, in his book Black Athena, discusses the moral dilemmas faced by Protestant societies that had to reconcile their actions of exterminating Native Americans and enslaving Africans with their core values of equality and individual freedom. These contradictions were often mitigated by strong racist attitudes. We covered Black Athena in a recent video. Cheikh Anta Diop, in Nations Nègres et Culture, highlights how the birth of modern Egyptology in the 19th century was marked by efforts to erase the memory of a Negro Egypt. Bernal further explains that to maintain the narrative of black inferiority, historians denied either that the ancient Egyptians were black, that they had a true civilization, or both. The hierarchy established by white supremacy has been used to justify various oppressive practices throughout history, such as the elimination of African Argentines, colonization, segregation, apartheid, and even contemporary forms of neocolonialism. The racist attitudes against our cousins in North America are another example. Police officers are likely to shoot an unarmed black person than they are to shoot an unarmed so-called white person. There is an endless list of injustices beyond the scope of this video. How about the Arabs in North Africa and the Middle East? The alliance between the Arab world and the West can be understood through historical and socio-political lenses. Racism towards black people in the Arab world has a long history, dating back to at least the 9th century, largely linked to the Arab slave trade. The interaction with Western ideas further entrenched the notion that lighter skin was superior to darker skin and reinforced the stereotype of equating black people with slaves. A key aspect of this relationship is the Arab world's claim over the legacy of Egyptian civilization. Despite not having a direct historical connection, this claim gives the Arab world a sense of legitimacy and ownership over territories in North Africa that they have conquered over the last 1,400 years. Despite historical conflicts between Arab countries and Western nations, there's a notable alignment of their elites, especially when it involves denying black people their rightful place in history. This common ground between these regions often revolves around maintaining control and suppressing the true contributions of black civilizations. Thanks for watching. You descend from a proud people with a dignified history. Be black and proud.